Codemotion.
Hi, hello. My name is Joel Hooks. I'm here to give you all a little presentation on AngularJS. You can find me on Twitter at @jhooks if you're interested in that sort of thing. Let's get started. So the question is, what is AngularJS? And it's JavaScript magic for building web applications, meaning it's doing a lot of things under the hood to help you build larger applications that are more organized. It's open source. It's MIT licensed. You can use it for anything. You can change it. You can distribute it in any way you see fit, which is very nice. And AngularJS is proper open source, meaning that they take commits. It's not several committers. You can go and look at their contributors page, and they actually will take your pull requests and bring them into the framework, assuming they pass the criteria. It's funded and staffed by Google. They have full-time engineers that are on the project. Misko Hevry is the father of AngularJS. He's a personal hero of mine and has been for many years. Prior to AngularJS, he's in the testing community, unit testing community. He's done a lot of great work and really pushed the agenda forward in that regard. So what's the problem anyway? Why do we need something like an AngularJS? Building complex web applications is difficult with any technology. I've done it with Flash, and I've done it with HTML and JavaScript, and it's difficult. Things get out of control. It spirals. You end up with spaghetti code. You end up with just all sorts of various problems that end up something like this. Just lots of moving parts, and they all need to talk together, and they all need to work together until you finally get to the end result. So we'll look at a little bit of history just to kind of go over where we've been and where we are now. This is what online looked like pre-internet. We connected with our 300 baud modems, and we're happy when we upgraded to 1200 baud modems. We waited to connect. We dealt with busy signals. 1989, Mr. Tim Berners-Lee gave us HTML. It's originally built for connecting scientific documents. We want to have links. We want to connect these documents. We want to be able to reference other documents. He wasn't thinking about the web applications that we're building today. Oops. In 1995, it starts to get real. We start to get, more people get internet in their home. We actually have browsers. We have the World Wide Web. DHTML is on the horizon. This is what Amazon looked like in 1995. I keep doing that, sorry. 2005, Ajax, Web 2.0. We start to see applications in our browsers. Gmail was probably one of the first significant applications, and it really was kind of a miracle of technology that they were able to pull off Gmail with what they had to work with. So where are we at today? We have broadband. We're on our mobile devices constantly. We need to have applications that function both in our desktop browsers and our mobile browsers. We have open web standards. We have people pushing the envelope forward. Things are vastly improved. But really, when you look at it, the same level of abstraction that we see today is what we had 20 years ago, meaning we have markup, we have JavaScript giving us some interactivity, but basically it's the same. So there's been lots of solutions. You have technologies that treat the browser as a dumb terminal. You have your Django, Rails, those sort of things that are delivering fully rendered pages to the browser. You have some technologies that are trying to abstract that away, EXTJS, Sprout Core, Cappuccino, other tech like that. And then you have these DOM manipulation technologies, like jQuery. And in comes AngularJS. So this is a hello world in the browser. This is just vanilla JavaScript. just to print out the text "Hello World." Obviously, we have to jump through some hoops for Internet Explorer generally. And this is probably one of the more complex Hello Worlds you're going to see. It's not super fun and not something I personally would ever want to write. Then we have jQuery, which really improves things quite a bit. You can see that this is something that we can understand. It's something that a human can look at and actually get as opposed to the vanilla JavaScript. And then we bring in AngularJS, and this is really tight and really concise. And once you understand the basic constructs of what Angular is doing for you, which we'll go over here in a minute, it really makes a lot of sense and gives you a simple way to interact with the browser and display the information that you're trying to display. So here's a little more expanded version of the Angular, and AngularJS is an MVC framework, model view controller. So this gets into introducing the controller aspect of it, and you can see the controller just inline in this case is just a simple constructor function that Angular understands, and we're able to supply it with values to this constructor. So you have some nice decoupling and separation here where your data and the manipulation of that data is separated from the actual markup. So here's another example, getting into some more interactivity. Obviously, that was just display. Here's a simple form and how we'd update our form via jQuery, which isn't too bad. I mean, I can deal with that, but really I prefer this. I like to have something simple. I can look at this and really understand what it is, and it saves my fingers a lot of effort when I'm working. And is this a critique of jQuery? It's not, because jQuery is awesome for what it does, and what it really does well is manipulates the DOM. Under the hood, we're actually using jQuery with Angular, so they're pretty close. Angular implements what they call jQuery Lite, which is the minimal interface for jQuery to do what it needs to do. And if you have jQuery loaded, it'll actually use the full version of jQuery so as not to have a dependency on jQuery. So what Angular provides us is this level of abstraction and gives us the ability to extend the grammar of HTML and get that clear separation of concerns that we were looking for. Angular also provides us with dependency injection, and we'll look at that a little bit closer in a moment. But it allows us to create these dependencies and provide them where and when we need them. So you're not having to rely on global state. You're not having to attach everything to window to access your data or access functionality that you might need. One thing that's really important to me is the testing story that Angular comes up with. Like I mentioned, Misko Hevery is, he's one of my testing gurus. He's somebody I looked to, when I was trying to figure out how to unit test in any of my applications. He was a guy whose opinion I really respect. And from the very start, his goal was to provide this testing story and allow us to have fully tested web applications. It's powered by, it was Testacular. They recently changed the name to Karma, which gives us unit tests and end-to-end functional tests. So you have, with testing generally, you have what I like to call a layer cake, with unit tests being the bottom layer. These are tests for us as developers. Then you go into end-to-end tests, which get into more functional. You're going to have less of those, but they're incredibly handy for smoke testing applications and that sort of thing. And it's all, they've built runners in, so we can easily do that stuff with low friction. Another feature that Angular provides us is HTML templating. Templates are just simple HTML snippets. They can, in this example, this is pointing to an external HTML file, and it'll load it in. This portion here is actually what this is pointing to, so that's being loaded in to the slide via a template. Another nice feature that it has is routing, which if you're familiar with, say, Ruby on Rails, or there's several other technologies that use this kind of style for routing. So you provide the destination, we provide our template, which is an external HTML file, and then we give it a controller to back that, kind of a code behind for our HTML. So another nice feature of Angular is this data binding, and you'll see this syntax here. It uses these curly bracket syntax. It's something you can configure. I know people will run into situations where they're using some templating language that'll conflict with this. However, they allow you to configure it if you needed to for your application. But it's very simple, and in this case, we have our input box, which is just a simple text input. And then we're defining this model, binding. And what that does is creates a binding object that we're directly binding to here. So as you can see, you type and it updates instantaneously. It's bound. You can pretty much bind to any object. It understands from just simple hash maps to arrays to strings to complex objects. Angular will take that in, understand them, and then provide you the result you're looking for. You can bind to properties on objects. You can bind to methods. So my personal favorite feature of Angular, and I'm going to kind of get into directives, and I had to make some choices here because of the 40-minute time limit, which frankly isn't enough to cover the whole framework. But I wanted to cover directives because it's probably the most important feature, at least to me. And there's some confusion just when you're trying to first get into Angular in terms of how directives work and what they actually provide for you. And what they do is this is where you get into extending the grammar of HTML. We're able to create new elements, attributes, or you can use CSS classes to provide these behaviors as well. So core to AngularJS is this list of directives. And you can see over here, they're actually overriding or extending some of the existing elements in our HTML. And they do that, you noticed before when I was typing in and I had the model hooked up to the input, they are overriding these so that the input will actually understand that and provide this easy back and forth with the binding. And there's a plethora of other built-in directives that you can use. Here's an example, ngRepeat. This is something that you'll use often if you have any sort of lists or, I don't know, the options are endless just for repeated data. So what we have here is the controller, which is simple JavaScript. This can be inline. It could be in a script tag. In this case, it's actually external. So we've defined on our scope some names. It's just an array. And then with our repeater, we're calling it, and you'll notice there's data ngRepeat. They actually allow you to remove data, so you just have ngRepeat, and then they have a namespace way too. So you can actually declare these in several ways. And then you say name in names. So this understands that we're currently looking at this scope and looks at the names array there, and then we'll list them out and repeat this list element for you for as many times, as obviously, as you have objects in your array. These can be more complex. You can make full components out of this, and it'll render them and display them for you. So here's a directive that I wrote, and this is a super simple directive, and it's called enter. And what this is looking for is for you to roll the mouse over that text. And once you do, this directive is bound to the mouse enter. So when we roll over that, we get the alert, which is here in our controller. So what this directive is doing is actually calling the display message method on this controller, which is what brings up the alert. This is nice because we're separating our actual directive from the functionality that we're ultimately going to do. So you could, this doesn't care what display message is. It's just going to call that, and then your controller is going to handle what actually happens when the message is displayed. Obviously, we don't want to litter our application with alerts, so that might become a pop-up or something later down the road. So here's kind of an improved version of this. So we have, you can see here's another enter. This is our directive. It's named here. You'll notice it's camel case down here. When it translates into an element that actually uses hyphens, and it kind of translates that for you, so it's a more semantically correct display of that. And we're sending in display message. So in this case, this is even more decoupled. Before we were calling display message on scope directly. In this case, we're passing in the string, and it's applying whatever that is, meaning that it's going to execute and kind of look at the string and execute it as a function. So in this case, this makes this highly reusable in that we can pass in any method at this point. So you can, you could use enter over and over again, passing in different methods as strings, and this enter directive is going to display or execute what it is you've told it to execute. So here's what I was discussing when I said it gets confusing, and this is frankly, there's a lot of intro to Angular that you can get to prior to getting to these directives, but I find these particularly confusing. And you'll notice this directive has different parts here, right? So it's a function that returns an object. We're restricting it to an attribute. That's what the A stands for. So there's A, E, and C, meaning attribute, element, and class. We're giving it a scope, meaning it's no longer sharing this scope and the scope of maybe other directives. It gets its own scope. And what a scope is in Angular, so you have a controller, and you apply a controller to a DOM element. It is a hierarchy, so you have a controller at the top, and you can have scopes inside of there. And what these do is limit it kind of gives them a sandbox to play in. So inside of a scope, if you have a top-level element, and it has a scope, all of the elements below that, if they have scopes themselves, will share their parent scopes all the way up to what you might call like a root scope. So this isolates and gives this directive its own scope. And each one of these, so if you had 5 of these, each one would have its own scope to work with. They're not going to share back and forth. You're not going to get any weird things where you update one and it updates all of them. And then we're binding to an attribute. And they use symbols to define these. It's this guy for the @ sign will give you an attribute, and it's looking at message. So you'll notice in the top where it says my message, this where you're passing in attributes will look, and it's bound directly to that. So you don't have to go in, and this is available on attributes as well, but this just gives you this nice short way to. So when I roll over that, it will display the message that I have inside of my declaration up there. And the element is actually a wrapped, it wraps this and it gives you some jQuery-like interactions with your elements. So you're able to link this directive to the actual DOM element, and then it passes in these, and you have access to the scope, you have the access to the element, and you have access to any of the attributes that are on this element, which is very nice because you can arbitrarily put attributes on your HTML element and then access them within your directive. So this allows you to pass in data. You can bind at that point, so it's going to be bound data, so this attribute will update, which is essentially what this is doing. This is a shortcut for that.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, please.
About the signature and the callback function.
Yes.
Is the signature always that? It's fixed? Meaning you always pass it scope, element, and attributes?
Yes, so the question is this link function always going to have this signature? And the answer is yes. It's something that, I'll create a macro in WebStorm to write because obviously you're going to write it over and over. And directives are something that you'll use continuously when you're building an Angular application. Directives are essentially components. So you can build these reusable components, and you can actually build up a library of directives that you can reuse from project to project, which comes in very handy. There's kind of a core set of directives, and we're using in an application that we're building, and we have 3 different applications, and we have a common library of directives that we're able to share. So here's another example where we're using this, and they call this an isolated scope, is what they call this, as opposed to if you remove that, it's now sharing the scope with this. Here, it's no longer sharing, it is inheriting and gets its own scope. So when it won't affect other directives or elements on our screen. So I normally give them more concise names, but enter two-way bound message is what this one is called. So you see it gets a little wordy up here. And we're passing in that message. And in this case, so we're bound again on that model. But when we click here, so what the directive is doing, it's looking for the click event. And when it receives that click event, it's actually adding to this message. So when we affect up here, it passes in and it's bound this way. And when we change it in the directive, it goes the opposite way. So we get this two-way binding, which is something that I would generally recommend is using with caution, because two-way binding can get you in interesting scenarios. But it's nice to have when you need it. So this is another interesting way. Oh, and you'll notice the equal sign here. The equals is two-way binding. They used to be words. They changed them to symbols when they hit 1.0. And the documentation has finally caught up to that and explains it fairly well. So another way we can bind here is via expressions. And in this case, I'm using 1 + 1. So it's not a complicated expression, but it can be any expression. So you can use a function or method and pass that in, and it's going to use that. You can do clever things like watch those expressions, and when they change, when the values of those expressions change, you can initiate some sort of action in your directive, which is a fairly common use case because our directive needs to communicate. And that's what this is all really about with these. With the binding. It's how do we allow these decoupled directives to communicate externally with other directives and controllers, and that's what we're doing here. So this uses an ampersand. I don't know how that relates to expression. The other one I kind of understand with the @ sign for attributes, but the ampersand gives us these bound expressions. So what's going to occur here, you'll notice that the message is actually using function notation down here. So when you bind this way and you bind to an expression and you use the ampersand, when you call it in here, you call it as a function. So effectively what that does is wraps this expression, 1 + 1, inside of a function. So here we're just showing an alert with the value of that. So it returns the result of that as the return value for your function. So I have some other stuff, and just to kind of, because I did these slides, and this is actually, I embedded Angular in here, so as to make it's kind of live. You notice that when I'm typing in. But let's actually look at these, if I can figure out how to, there we go. There we go. All right. So here you can see the various directives that I was using in there. In addition to those directives, the examples, I had a couple more complex ones, and I thought these were interesting just in that I'm using external libraries and that sort of thing. In a couple places in these slides, let's see if I can. So you notice up front here, I got a little clock and it's spinning and it's updating every second. And that's actually using Moment.js, which is a really, really fantastic time and date library. So what we have is a directive, and inside of this directive is a template. So you can put arbitrary HTML in the templates, and this is inline. If they're simple, that's fine. Otherwise, you're going to want to use an external template URL. Let's see. It's generally called partials. Angular has a really, really excellent bootstrap or kind of seed app is what they call it. So you can go to the website and download the seed app, and it kind of gives you a basic structure to allow you to build your application. Generally speaking, you'll grow out of that, and you'll want to build your own structure and make your own decisions in that regard. But it has the end-to-end tests are hooked up, the unit tests are hooked up. It works with Testacular. They have some decent examples just to show you the initial wiring of that, and I highly recommend going and looking at that. But in this case, so I'm using a div, and I have a paragraph. I want it monospaced, so that's just all typical CSS, and then I'm binding to current time. I'm isolating this scope, so current time is only relative to this directive. And then what I like to do, you'll notice in the previous examples, the link function was actually in the return object inline, but I like to make these kind of private variables up here and then use the reference this function in this fashion just to kind of clean it up a little bit. But it's really simple. We're setting the current time variable on the scope, so this binding will reference that current time. So this is just a set interval at every 1 second. Uses Moment.js, and we'll apply that format as the current time. So this is a string that's getting updated, but it's doing so every second, so we get the time display, which is kind of cool. I use elements and attributes primarily. I don't, because you can put, if you put C in here, now you can use this as a CSS class, which I think is kind of odd, but maybe something that people might prefer. I really, really like using the elements because, this is called current time. So when you look at the markup, show you that. Sorry. So this is what it looks like in markup. So it's just a simple element, and like I said, this is extending the grammar of HTML. So we can make our components and name them as we want. And some people quibble because of the semantic correctness, because obviously if it's not an HTML element, it will not pass the W3C validator, but now we add data in front of it. Angular still understands that. It'll understand it in both ways. You don't have to actually put the data when you name that. Right, and the other one, I don't know if y'all noticed it, but I made a little BBS simulator here. So you can see this down at the bottom. 300 baud, it was tedious. I don't know if anybody had to sit through that, but it wasn't a whole lot of fun. Things are a lot better now. 40 megabits in your pocket. So this is similar concepts here. We have a simple link function. And I'm using, for my slide deck here, I'm using the wonderful Reveal.js, which is a nice presentation tool. But I'm able to access Reveal inside of my directive, right? So what a directive really essentially is it's like when you're building this application, it's like, where do I put my jQuery code? Where do I do, complex animations or things of that nature? And where you do that is inside of your directive. It's that separation. It's like traditionally you have a giant JS file, or you try to you can use all sorts of different approaches to do that. But Angular provides this really concise way to utilize external libraries and keep them contained, so their touch points aren't all throughout your application. When you're wondering where your jQuery code is, you don't have to even really consider it, you know it's going to be with your directives. So again, this is pretty simple. We have a link function. It passes in those three standard arguments. Then we have some local variables. A little next function. This is because Reveal has some event listeners. So I'm actually using Reveal's internal eventing system, and I'm able to leverage that and have my directive react to those events. So it does that and then changes the displayed message. And again, the template's just a simple paragraph. That's what the partials, this example. So this is just a simple div. The templates are HTML. But you can make these complex. So these can be really complex external partials that you can pull in, and you can nest those. They have a way to include those easily, so you can include them inline. You can define them with your routes. You can define them inside of your directives. So Angular really gives you some flexibility in terms of how you separate. So while it is fairly opinionated, it's not rigidly opinionated. And I guess a rigidly opinionated framework might be more of an Ember, where you have a backbone. In the total unopinionated, this is kind of, here's some tools, go build whatever house you would like to build. Angular sits somewhere in the middle, which I personally find is a sweet spot of tools and direction, but without restricting me and putting me in too much of a box when I'm building my applications. I really appreciate that freedom, especially as an application grows to significant size. Let's see. And I'm going to put these slides online, so it makes a decent little example using Grunt and Angular and all that fun stuff for the slide deck. All right, so I recommend two resources. Egghead.io is built by John Lindquist, who is the evangelist for WebStorm. Watching him use WebStorm will have you breaking out your credit card and buying a license fairly quickly. But I even put his videos, and these are all video screencasts. He does them live. They're not a whole lot of production, but he's really good at what he does. So those I put even above reading the docs. I would start at his videos and then move to AngularJS. They built incredible documentation. They have a tutorial which is fabulous, and you go through, and it's called PhoneCat is the name of the app. So you build something that's kind of a non-trivial application, and they have it set up with tests, end-to-end tests, and unit tests. So you go through and you build the whole thing from scratch, and it's a really great starting point. And they have some of the best documentation I've seen for any library generally, and I think that really gets back to the Google funding and having full-time, extremely talented engineers on this project is really kind of a big benefit to Angular generally. So that's it. Do we have any questions? I think we're at 15 after. I have 5 more minutes. So. Yes, sir. So I really like Backbone. I think it's a great library. But Backbone is kind of a framework for people who like to write frameworks. And it's not that there aren't people that have put abstractions on top of that, because you have Marionette and Aura, and there's other really talented people working on that. Jeremy Ashkenaz has provided so much. He's pushed the envelope and advanced with CoffeeScript and Backbone and Underscore. And I absolutely love his work and totally respect that project. I haven't used it on anything large, though, but people are. It's used all over the place. And like if I was to sit down and choose like what I was going to start my next project with, it would be Angular or Backbone. At this point, I have considerably invested a lot of time into Angular, so I kind of lean to that direction. And I just really love the kind of, like I said, the testing story and those things that they've put behind that, and that Google's backing it. It's not going anywhere. Not that Backbone's going anywhere either, but. I mean, frankly, you really can't go wrong with either. But it's just, if you're into a more loose approach and want to, have more freedom, have ultimate freedom, then Backbone would definitely be a good choice. Yes, sir?
What about the routing part? The routing part?
The routes?
Yeah, just now Angular can match all the basic part of routing, like a single word and all complicated regex or something like that. You know about something, the evolution of routing magic?
So the question is the routing more advanced than what I showed, and can you use more, expressions and have ID? It essentially, the Angular routing uses a kind of a typical RESTful approach to it. So you can add IDs and variables, and it'll understand that and deliver you. You can send parameters in a couple different ways so that when it arrives at your controller, that controller is actually delivered parameters and that sort of thing. So it's really pretty nice. Yeah, it works out pretty well. It's fairly advanced and allows a lot of options. I haven't run into any problems with the routing, and it kind of, I don't know, when you set it up and you kind of do the RESTful and kind of mirror what your server is, with what your REST services are, then you get a kind of a logical approach to it. Yes, sir.
What about the performance?
Can you repeat? Can you speak up a little bit? I can't hear.
What about the performance? Comparing AngularJS with GP performance on browsers.
Oh, we are running an application currently, and it's very complex and has a lot of data grids and long lists, and it's both web, desktop, and mobile. And it performs really, really well. We're able to have virtualized data grids with tens of thousands of items, and we get decent scrolling. I haven't had any real performance issues. And I suppose it really depends on the type of application you're building. But like I said, if you're doing jQuery and you need stuff that's closer to the metal, or you're doing raw JavaScript, you need it closer to the metal, you can embed that inside of a directive, and at that point you can really run kind of as fast and as raw as you want to, and you're not really limited by Angular. If you're not moving around and going between different routes, if you're on a screen, then you're going to get the kind of native performance that you expect, and Angular really shouldn't affect. Obviously, when you're doing things, you have, say, long repeaters, and you have a ton of data binding, you can get into a situation where you really have to start to think about performance and what you're doing, because it's updating back and forth and doing DOM updates. But they've intelligently added that in there, and they are optimizing it, and they're really smart about that sort of thing. So yeah, that's a problem with any single page app, right? And they're working on solving that. Like if you go to AngularJS.org, it is an Angular app, but I've seen Misko talk about it, and they had to do some tricks to make it, because typically speaking, a web app isn't going to be searchable anyway. Like like it's a contained app. It's outside of the search scope. It's not a web page, which would be different, and you definitely want to optimize. There's ways to do it, but it has the same problems you'd expect, with the hash bang and that sort of thing. It does have HTML5 mode, which you can remove the hash bang from your routes, and it'll gracefully degrade as needed. So that's kind of a problem with single-page JavaScript-based apps generally. So there's ways around it, but yeah, you kind of have to think about it. It's definitely an issue. Yes, sir.
About the directives, is there any effort to organize the development of directives into libraries? I mean, is there any? Did you ever see any problem of namespace pollution? I mean, everyone can write its own directives, and it looks like your page is going to be. It can become some kind of custom HTML.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's obviously you're going to have to, when you're organizing directives, you want them, you're going to have to control namespacing. I think you have to be intelligent about that. But it has a really nice module system. So you declare modules, and you can inject those modules into other modules. So you have a root app, but these can be brought in, and you can say it requires this, and it kind of, frankly, I don't use require.js on Angular projects because I don't need it, because it has a kind of a built-in system for providing those dependencies and organizing, and they can be external, and I don't know, it works pretty well.
You're kind of encapsulating it into your code.
Exactly, and so you could have one directive per file, and they could even be its own module that can be imported into other applications. I think my time's up. Looks like we're transitioning, so one question. I don't know how far it goes back, but I have not had any problems with, I think it supports Internet Explorer 7. I know 9 and above, but you know, we're in pretty clear waters at that point. But yeah, I haven't had any problems, and I think it might even be 6. So, and it'll gracefully degrade. I believe it will go back to Internet Explorer 6, but maybe not. All right, well, I appreciate it. Thank you all very much.
Codemotion.